Welcome to What If Gran Turismo Theory had quote-unquote standard cars. By standard cars, I mean like how Gran Turismo 5 and 6 had cars from the previous console generation ported to those games. That's what I mean. So essentially cars from the PlayStation 1 era Gran Turismo ported to the PS2. So let's get into it, folks. To begin with, Gran Turismo 3 is universally known as one of the best Gran Turismos in the series history, and it is the highest selling in the series history. But it's also widely known that one of, if not the biggest drawback of GT3 was the lack of cars in the game. It only had 100 something cars in the game, and comparing that to Gran Turismo 2 of over 650, that ain't the dandiest in the world. So, you could make an argument that's straightforward. More cars equals even better success, but as we've seen with Gran Turismo 5 and 6, some people have definitely argued against that. I've said it since Gran Turismo 5 came out. I am very much for standard cars in those games. Of course, GT3 ain't those games, but there's plenty of people who are against standard cars in those games too. And I understand the reasoning behind it. They just don't really feel like they're in place. The amazing graphics of Gran Turismo 5 and 6 at the time, compared to, well, I mean, some cars are barely even PS2 graphics. Remember the Daihatsu, rectangle car that looked like it was something out of Minecraft. I can't remember the exact name of it, but if you know, you know. And even in the PS2, they were kind of not really straight up standard and premium cars, but there were cars of different qualities even in the PS2. So in the PS3, with having the PS2 era cars, it was a massive difference. And an argument could be made that there was even a bigger difference between a PlayStation 1 looking car and a PlayStation 2 looking car. But the way that I saw it for Gran Turismo 5 and 6 is that it's better to have them in a low quality than none at all. If you didn't like looking at them, you didn't have to drive them. So it wasn't the biggest deal in the world. Granted, I'm not going to deny that to an extent they did look out of place, but also remember that in Gran Turismo 5 and 6, a lot of the Gran Turismo original circuits were actually kind of just more upgraded, upscaled versions of the PS2 versions. They weren't really completely made from the ground up, so that was kind of like the cars in the game as well. So how does this all tie to Gran Turismo 3? Well, all of the Gran Turismo original circuits were remade for GT3. Even back in GT3, there were some slight layout changes of the circuits, like we've had between some original circuits from previous games to even GT7. For over 20 years, there's been some changes in how the circuits run, but nonetheless, there's no denying that the circuits looked a lot better in GT3 than they did in GT1 and 2. So, it's harder to make the argument for GT3 having standard cars than it is for GT5 having standard cars. And there were a lot of people who didn't agree with it in GT5. So, let's just say that Gran Turismo 3 did get the standard cars. One of the major changes that this would make is that there would be no argument in GT5 because it would have just set the precedent in GT3. Granted, I'm not going to say everyone on the internet wouldn't have mentioned it whatsoever. There would have been a few mentioning it, but a whole heck of a heap less than what did end up getting mentioned. And Gran Turismo 3 and Gran Turismo 5, the first games on each console, were the two best-selling Gran Turismos of all time. One with the standard cars and one without. So I don't really think there's a logical correlation between if there is or isn't standard cars and how well the game sells. The real correlation is how the game is received. And again, GT5 would be received a whole heck of a heap different. So let's look into GT3 would be received differently. I've told the story before that my dad traded in an old station wagon that barely ran for a PlayStation 2 bundled with Gran Turismo 3 the day that it came out. The station wagon broke down less than a week later, and it was worth more than the cost of it to fix, so the PlayStation 2 with GT3 was the much better deal. Also, there was a lot that happened with GT3 coming out. As far as I know, GT Planet was pretty much created because of GT3 coming out. That was the inspiration for it to be made. And there was many other forums back in the day as well for Gran Turismo. There was actually a competition for Gran Turismo forums back in the day. As far as I know, the only one that's really still active anymore is GT Planet. If you do your own research, there's Gran Turismo forums as far back as 1998. And there were quite a few in 2001. So essentially what I'm saying is a lot of people were hyped for GT3. The main hype for Gran Turismo 3 was how amazing the graphics were at the time, as we saw showcased in Gran Turismo 2000. Gran Turismo 2000 is a little bit infamous now for other reasons, but there's no denying that for the time the graphics were downright amazing. There were no other racing games that could possibly come close to it. And even just seeing the one track in GT 2000 got people so hyped for the graphics that it was a system seller for the PlayStation 2. And, again, it was the highest selling in the series. GT 2000, I think whether there ended up being standard cars in GT3 or not, would have had the same car and track roster. They wouldn't have put the PS1 standards in GT 2000. So you could make an argument that if GT3 came out with the standard cars, it would be false advertising because GT 2000 didn't have them. But the way that I see it is not too big of an argument was made about how GT5 Prologue didn't have standard cars and GT5 did. People understood by then that a prologue and a demo are different things than the full game. So I don't think that would have had too big of an impact on the overall hype for the game. In general, hype too is meant to be before game releases. And you could also make an argument that Polyphony Digital probably wouldn't have made any pre-release trailers showing that there were standard cars, but probably what they would have done is to say how big the car list was, at least quite close to when the game came out. So that could be a little bit of false advertising, because honestly, in some of the trailers in Gran Turismo 5, people genuinely believed that there would be over 1,000 premium cars. From what I remember at the time, I just didn't really care that much either way. I just wanted a new Gran Turismo by then. It'd been so long since GT4. I would say a lot of people were in the same boat I was as well, but still. Now granted, there wasn't nearly as long of a time between GT4 and 5 as there was between GT2 and 3, and that's another argument to be made if the standard cars were ported over to GT3. Because there's more than just porting over the car itself. The graphics of the car could stay the same between the PS1 and PS2 era. Again, could. I'll get into that in a minute. But one thing that could not stay the same is the physics of the car. Gran Turismo 2, as a game, drove different than GT3. So each and every car that got ported over would have had to have been changed for the physics of the new game. Yeah, granted, I have no idea what takes longer now or then to make a new car model or to change the physics for the new game. What I do know now is car models take a whole heck of a heap longer to make than they did back then, but I still don't know the exact timeline of which took longer, different eras, and all that. So we'll say this. It's all purely speculation, and it didn't end up happening, so all this video is truly a what if. I'm not an expert on anything that I'm saying. Take it all with a grain of salt, or the entire shaker, whatever you may be. So, yeah. I don't particularly think it would have affected the game too much, one way or the other, in terms of getting the physics done. Back then, things could just be done faster in general because games weren't advanced as much, but I do believe it would have pushed the release date of the game back some. Granted, it wasn't a PS2 launch title anyway, so I don't think that would have hurt the sales pushing the launch date back from some. Well, let's just say, tentatively speaking, that it would have made the game come out in 2002. I don't think it would have been anything massive, but I will say a 2002 release date. I don't think the individual month particularly matters too much, especially because back then some regions got some games before others and all that. So let's just say 2002 in general. So how many cars would have GT3 had at that point? I mean, the way that I see it, having such, even still with the release date being pushed back, little gap between GT2 and 3, given that GT5 could keep the vast majority of cars as what GT4 had, I think they literally only had 4 or 5 that didn't make it between GT4 and 5. So, between GT2 and 3, they would have kept all but that, if not even less so, because it is even less of a gap. I believe because there was already 100 and something that ended up as premium, or 650 that didn't, there could have legitimately have been 800 cars coming out in GT3. Granted, that's 650 of them being standard, but still. 800 cars in 2002, and then some of them still look downright stunning for the time, to me would have been downright amazing. Again, some people may have cried false advertising for that, because I doubt the trailers would have realistically shown the standard cars. GT2000 didn't show the standard cars. But the way that I see it overall is that it sold the system so well, it became the best selling in the franchise. People were so hyped for that game, nonetheless, they would have bought it. Now, granted, something that might have happened, because again, there is a bigger difference between a PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 model than there was between a PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 model. After people bought the game, there might have been some backlash to Polygon Digital to upgrade the cards, but then we can already lead to the next game. Gran Turismo 4 had around 750 premium cards for the PlayStation 2. Again, there was still that Hatsu rectangle-looking car that looked like it was for Minecraft, but at least 725, I think, could pass for being on the PlayStation 2. So the vast majority of the car list, to the point of it was pretty much accepted as the entire car list. I think GT4 would have been roughly the same game. Maybe because GT3 had a release date a little bit after, if they would have ported the cars from PS1 to PS2, it would have pushed GT4's release date a little bit back too. But I would say, realistically speaking, it wouldn't have made all that big of a difference. There would have been more of a difference for GT3 and GT4. So let's just say GT4 still came out in 2005. Maybe we can say all the regions get it in late 2005, when I think even some of the regions may have gotten it just barely in 2004. Let's just say late 2005 for GT4. What game would have been considered better by fans between GT3 and GT4? I think it definitely at that point would have ended up being GT4, because all of the cars would have ended up premium in GT4. At the very least, you can say that maybe it would have gotten some of the standards back, because there was 800 cars GT3, 750 GT4. PD may have still wanted there to be more cars in GT4. I mean, even still, that 50 car for difference. Let's say GT4 at max had 850 cars, 100 or so, which was standard. GT4, I think, would have been considered overall the better. I mean, that's kind of what happened in our timeline anyway. GT3 was high selling, and there's certainly a lot of people out there that consider it the best one, but I think overall, people consider Gran Turismo 4 better than GT3 on average. I mean, they're probably, between all the Gran Turismos, GT4 is considered the best of all of them on average. I don't think there's a majority of any. Like, on even any console, I don't think majority people even say one is better than the other for, like, any era of games. GT is one of those where an argument can kind of be made for every game that came out for it being the best. But I think the highest percent would still go GT4 no matter what ended up happening. I guess an argument kind of that could be made too is the user versus professional scores of each game when they came out at the time, but that wasn't nearly as big of a deal as it is now, because the internet was at its infancy back then. maybe it would have had GT3 get a higher rating, maybe it would have been lower. Hard to really say for sure. I think it kind of would have been depended on how it was advertised, and again, I think they would have leaned the way of a bit of false advertising. So maybe while it wouldn't affect for personal reviews, it may have had some user reviews give it a lower score. Look at what happened with GT7. There was a lot of false advertising for GT7. The quote-unquote professional reviews were high. The user scores were incredibly low, and deservedly so, for GT7. I really don't think GT3 would have got the backlash to GT7. I mean, a lot of GT7's thing was the macrotransactions, which obviously didn't exist for the PS2, but overall, yeah, I could actually see GT3 getting a slightly lower user score, but again, that didn't matter nearly as much in selling of games as it does now with everyone having internet. So maybe that would have quote-unquote tarnished GT3's legacy a little bit, but I think what it would have done is actually made GT4 look that much more amazing. Whether it did have a few compared to its total amount of standard cars or not. I think if GT3 had standard cars, GT4 would be considered, bar none, undisputed, the best Gran Turismo in the entire franchise at this point. Because it would have at least almost equaled the car list of what GT3 had, if all of them been premium for the time. And maybe it would have made GT4 the highest selling Gran Turismo ever. To be honest, I think GT3 would have actually had higher sales if it had the standard cars than not. It would have had a lot more people disappointed. It would have had a lot of people return the games, but back then I sure really don't know if a game returned means -1 on the sales. I'm not really sure. But I think it might have actually slightly helped the sales because it would have got more people interested from the PS1 era to go ahead and upgrade to PS2 because they could still drive the cars they knew back then with the new tracks of the series and all that. Again, the tracks were upgraded. I'm not really talking about the tracks being ported from PS1 era to PS2. I can make a video about the tracks if y'all want, but I'm talking more about the cars. So anyway, yeah, I think it would have actually helped the sales of GT3 a little bit, although maybe not its reputation. But I think it really would have helped the sales of GT4 because GT4 would have truly been the total package. It would have had, still considered for the time, a massive car list, whether it had a few of the standards or not. And it just would have, the vast majority of cars would have looked so much better than GT3 anyway. Granted, in the timeline that we got, there's the massive argument in GT4 being better than GT3. Because while, yes, the individual cars didn't look particularly much better than GT3, there were just way more of them. I mean, still, even in our timeline, if you compare the cars from GT4 to GT2, even that's not a massive increase. GT2 had 650 something. GT4 had 750 something, so it'd be more about how the cars looked on either timeline, really, and especially so in this timeline. So I think what GT3 would have had some incremental sales increases. If GT4 was truly advertised as the return to the best looking racing game in the world, and Polyphony Digital, Sony, all that advertised it and said straightforward that all the cars were premium, all of them looked the best they possibly could and all that, then GT4 would have actually sold noticeably better. I'm not going to say straightforward of which one do I think would have sold better between GT3 and 4, because all in all it's not particularly all that important. They both sold amazing in our timeline anyway. But I think the major difference really would have ended up being GT5. Because with, again, the precedent being set that the first game in the series gets the standard cars anyway, it wouldn't have been nearly of a disappointment in GT5 as it was. So then it would have actually been 3 games in a row, undisputed, amazing for the franchise. Again, GT3 might have had a bit less user score, but in terms of the quote-unquote professional reviewers, GT3 would have got roughly the same as it did in real life, which was At least 9 out of 10 for everyone. GT4 might have actually gotten slightly better professional reviewer score and way better user. And then GT5 would have had higher scores too, because both the professionals and the users would have realized that there was a very much high likelihood that GT5 was going to get standard cars. No one would have been fooled by that or whatever it may be. So GT5 would be considered undisputed one of the best in the franchise. There's people now that argue that GT5 was the biggest disappointment in the franchise history. I certainly don't. I consider GT5 the second best game in the entire Gran Turismo franchise. But again, like I said of GT3, I understand where people are coming from with that. I mean, all things considered, while GT5 had a lot of things, a lot of the things weren't really done to their fullest extent. As I've kind of already hinted at before, I'd rather the thing be there to some degree than none at all, but still. And ultimately, I don't think GT5's release date would have been changed at all. I think it would have came out at the same time. As long as it took to make GT5 in general, it had to come out 2010 realistically. So, yeah. If it would have gone on any longer, then that would have made Sony so bad by that point that it just realistically wouldn't have happened. Especially, too, with GT5 released with the peak of the 3D stuff. Remember, GT5 had the 3D gaming at launch. GT6 got an update later. That was a massive thing as well. That probably, I would say that may have even sold 1 million or so copies just on that. So really beyond GT5, it would have been the same. Now granted, GT5 and 6, again, I think it would have been the same. By GT6, I think the rating still would have gone down anyway. GT6 was so far removed from GT3, no matter what happened in either timeline, I think GT6 would have gotten pretty much the same user score, professional score, and sales. Maybe just slightly better in general because everyone had a slightly better, on average, look of the franchise, but I don't think it would have made more than even a 5 or so percent difference. Would GT Sport then get the standard cars? They definitely wouldn't be getting the PS1 era standard cars. Again, we eliminated that mostly, if not all, from GT4. I don't think it would have got the PS2 era cars unless they're incredibly upscaled. Like, GT6 actually had different names. Like, GT5 named them straightforward, standard, and premium. But then GT6 kind of had a thing in the middle where some of the standard cars were a bit upgraded. I would say 99% chance that GT Sport wouldn't have had PS2 era cars. But, I mean, maybe there would have been a slight bit in there, because who knows? If there was just a better look on the franchise in general, the next GT after GT6 might not have been GT Sport. A lot of the reason I think GT Sport was made was just so there could be a new look on a franchise whose popularity and overall appeal was waning a little bit after GT6. It's to say, for convenience sake, that it was still GT Sport. But what I do think would be different is I think it would have actually gotten some upscaled PS3 models. As far as I know, don't quote me on this, but as far as I know, Gran Turismo, to this day, uses somewhat of how they even had cars back in the earliest PS3 days. Like the Gran Turismo 5 demo prologue thing, the one at Eiger Nordwan that had a mid-speed Lancer and the Lotus Elise, which obviously we don't use the Lotus Elise now, and things of that nature. As far as I know, there's some documentation out there that the PS3 era cars had 500,000 polygons. I don't know if that means including like the interior of them or if that's just the body. I don't know if that counts for like cars that could have removable damage parts, like with some of the Subaru Impreza Rally car in GT5. I don't know if that counted where some of them you could see under the car and you could see its suspension and stuff when it was jumping, or the hood would open if it was damaged. I don't know if it counts on that. But it seems like I don't know if it's straight up confirmed. I highly doubt Polyphony Digital said it themselves. But it seems like I have read somewhere that even in modern Gran Turismos, like GT Sport onwards, the cars are still using, to some degree, the same amount of polygons and areas as it was with even GT5 Prologue and stuff. Granted, its rival, Forza, is doing this as well. People made a big deal out of the new Forza Motorsport trailer, having it not really showcased, but people could tell. The cars looked basically the same in a few instances as they did even on the PS3. They kind of just look like slightly upscaled versions of that. And generally speaking, Forza is advertising that Motorsport's going to have downright amazing world-changing and leading graphics. We'll see when it comes out, but essentially what I'm saying, when the competitors are doing it, Gran Turismo may have done it as well. Now, granted, again, like I've said, if you can find that article, I don't even, again, know if it's confirmed. It may have just been more of a debate. I remember at some point between, like, 2016 and now, it was mentioned on GT Planet, but I can't remember the name of the thread or article or whatever it was. I can't remember. But some people could make the argument that even the cars that we're driving to this day in GT7 are just extremely upscaled versions of what we were driving in 2006 and the GT5 demo prologue thing. I don't know if any of those cars are actually still ran GT7, but they're definitely at least a few from GT5 prologue, so we can say that for sure. The one in 2007, the $40 one. So, that's something to consider. So I think in GT Sport, there almost certainly would have been in the timeline of which GT3 got some standard cars. There would have been some semi-premium and then some straight-up premium versions. And I think GT7 would have realistically released, or not GT7, GT Sport would have realistically released with around about 400 to 500 cars, I think. I don't think they would have ever tried for it to be close to the numbers of GT6 or anything like that. Again, GT6 would be essentially the same and would have its same car count and all that as it does in this world timeline. So GT Sport would have its same number as it released with, fully premium, 100 and something, and then 400 or 500 or so cars. Total, that would be semi-premium, look better than they did in GT6, and it would be all the models that were considered premium for GT6. Just slightly improved, ported over versions, kind of like we got with GT6 between the PS2 era bone stock and the semi-premium, like the 1970 Dodge Charger. That was an example of a semi-premium. The only one I can think of off the top of my head, but I think there were a fair few. So I do believe that most likely that would have happened with GT Sport as well, and I don't really think it would have changed GT Sport's legacy much. Because ultimately GT Sport was more about the driving and the realism and such than it was necessarily the cars looked. Obviously GT Sport very much, like PD and Sony advertised it was a great looking game. But more than anything, they just advertised that the driving was well, like the physics model as well. It was simulation racing. So I think GT Sport with some semi-premiums in there, I think it would have sold a fair bit better, but we don't even know how many copies GT Sport sold officially. After GT6 for GT Sport or 7, we don't even know official numbers. So I would just say it would have made some difference, but not massively so. And then on to GT7. I mean, GT7's problem was never really the car list. Some slight user debate was that there weren't too many, like, 2020s cars in the game, and there weren't the most updated versions of the Group 4 and Group 3. And yeah, I agree, that was a problem, but one of many problems that GT7 had. So I would say GT7 would have launched with maybe a few more cars But GT7 did advertise the graphics way more than GT Sport did. So I don't think there would have been any official semi-premium PS3 carryover. Again, maybe there's an argument that there are actually still some extremely upscaled PS3 carryovers still around. But GT7 overall would have been pretty much as bad as it is in this timeline. There wouldn't, like with GT6, I don't think there would have been a major difference really. Now, granted, you can make the argument that, oh, in this timeline, that actually means that GT Sport would have ended with more cars than what GT7 came out with. Yes, but I mean, just there's not that much nice I can really say about GT7 other than the graphics. I mean, I've kind of mentioned that before. So, yeah, I'll just kind of end it off at that. It is kind of a sour note that on either timeline, GT7 would still be a bad game, but overall, I think the franchise would actually be looked at as, throughout its entire timeline, more well respected. GT3 would have been a little bit less well respected, but I still think it would have been right there up to, if not still the highest selling in the franchise, overall selling more than it did in this timeline. It would have made GT5 be well more respected. I think it would have been a trifecta of GT3, 4, and 5 in hindsight would all be considered pretty much tied for the greatest Gran Turismo of all time. With 4 maybe still eking out a little bit of edge because 4 would have had literally everything. Because obviously in this timeline 4 did have all the premiums for PS2. But as well, GT5 even sold Inner Timeline. GT5 probably would have been right up there with GT4 and 3 in terms of sales, too, in terms of most of all time. So it would definitely be a net positive for the franchise in total. And it would make it to where it could actually leave the door open for a future game having some more standard cars. Like, let's say Gran Turismo for the PlayStation 6 could have some PS5 cars carry over and people wouldn't really care. Granted, that's kind of what happened with GT7. Anyway, we've had some PS4 cars carry over. We had cars carry over from GT Sport to GT7, but GT7 is a PS4 and PS5 game, so it's not the best example in the world. I would say the next time in the franchise that if GT3 would have had standards, would have affected the franchise at all from now on, would maybe be the first PlayStation 6 exclusive Gran Turismo, or if it was PC by then, whatever. But beyond that, at this point, I think for the time being, Gran Turismo 7 would still be as bad as it is. But overall, I feel like the franchise would be more well respected on average. Sales would be slightly higher overall for the franchise. And it would certainly be worth a haul. A few people undoubtedly would say otherwise. A few people may have been turned off from the series from GT3 onwards. But I feel like overall there would be more people. Not that many, because GT7's a bad game. But still more people around today than there would be in how it ended up. And overall, that's worth a yeehaw! If it happened. If only, folks. If only.